this. So thank you for your time and kind of investment. This is Ecological Citizens Project, which is located over in Garrison. They've done a lot of community advocacy, so you could check out their website. It's less specific to native plants. They're not landscape architects or designers, they're community organizers. But they've done all sorts of things, and I know this would be a great resource for us to connect with. So they've done all sorts of change campaigns, working with the town of Phillipstown, about community choice aggregation, so kind of coming together. So I think it's Poughkeepsie, Beacon, Cold Spring, Fishkill, all came together as a collection of homeowners, and then now are buying renewable energy, or seeking to buy renewable energy as a conglomerate, rather than individual people at the behest of the power companies. So finding ways of kind of integrating our community within the larger Hudson Valley community of people that are doing things really actively on stormwater management, on energy, on carbon, and thinking a little bit more broadly about our impact and how we can actually use the resources that are already here to kind of propel us into the future. So thank you.
Thank all of you so much. Thank everybody for coming. I know that people have to leave, but if the two of you can stay a little longer, then I think we will have some questions, because personally really interested in hearing some dialogue between the two of you. I think we really heard the same objectives from both people, but from some slightly different perspectives. And it's such a treat and so wonderful for all of us. So thank you. Thank you for being here. So, anybody?
Yeah, AJ, question for you.
Sure.
You talked about silt ponds as well. We've been implementing that for a long time around here, but we want to improve on it. Do you have any designs that maybe you can share? Which ones work best?
I can reach out and look at some of the lakes in Connecticut that we've done some stuff on. In New York, the one is the Osceola one. The one problem with that is the groundwater table is kind of high. So the condition I showed you in the first picture, I don't know if you remember back there, it was filled. That wasn't filled because of stormwater, that was filled because of groundwater. So understanding the groundwater table, because when you have stormwater that comes in, that becomes a flow-through system and doesn't actually settle anything out. So it'll partially work, so that's a consideration. Really, the goal, and just speaking in general, you're trying to make all the particulate from the stormwater settle out. So the best way you can do that, leaving native plants, possibly, there was a homeowner I visited over at Mayapack on Kirk Lake who actually built a swale on his own property and diverted a catch basin into the swale and was able to, and he digs it out every 3 months or so to keep it deep, and then that infiltrates into a wetland and kind of and he's actually on a pretty steep incline, so it's a pretty impressive project.
Yeah, I mean, what we've done here and is usually we'll just try to create, like with rock, a retaining pond to catch the sediment. And in some places are close to the road where the town will come and dig it out every year or so.
Another interesting strategy is to do, if you're on a slope, stepped ponds, because every time the water fills up and goes to the step, a portion of that water infiltrates and settles out as it goes down. So that could be another strategy. Really, it's very site specific.
I would say it's not like, I don't think we could adopt a plan from another place and say it's here. I really think you need to come up with have a environmental engineer help identify which areas apply for which treatments, and then size it appropriately and construct it appropriately so that it's going to be managed over time and cleaned out, right? I mean, all those sediment traps will have to be. That's
the other thing, So on Osceola, or in the watershed of Osceola, those sediment traps get dumped up pretty quickly.
Right, and that's why the town clears it out. And we did reach out to the town engineer and the wetlands inspector as well to review some of the past plans that we had. But I was just wondering if you had any other ones that you can share.
If you want, I can give you contact info. I can show you a bunch of general ones. Going off David's point a little bit is, if you're going to undertake any of these big projects, it's really suggested to bring in an engineer, because you want to make sure that you're targeting, you're going to have the most impact for the least amount of money in those areas. So
Right.
a lot of times stormwater, you know, I've seen lakes that have built stormwater, you know, retention ponds and tributaries that were clean before, you know, and they just did it out of necessity of the area. And while it looks nice, there was a whole bunch of other streams they probably could have done something similar for the same amount of money to get a bigger impact. So I'd really, you know, take it slow, but I can, you know, I can send you some stuff.
There's I know Osceola Lake had a problem with wetlands pretty far from the lake that
Yeah.
were polluting the lake. We have a lot of wetlands around here, and you know, you can put your leaves in there, you can put your branches in there. Does that add to the nutrients going into the lake when you dump things in the wetlands?
So wetlands are an interesting case normally, and as I spoke about, kind of spoke of it very superficially. Normally they're pretty good at holding in some nutrients. Nitrogen is actually more mobile in sediments than phosphorus. So sometimes wetlands will be exporting more nitrogen than they would be uptaking it. So it's possible. The other thing, I go back once again to site specificness, some wetlands, not all wetlands are created equal in terms of the type of vegetation that's there and the type of ability they have to infiltrate. So in terms of your equipment, it's possible that they're polluting, and as far as what you put in, also, you don't want to, wetlands are the same as lakes in terms of you don't want to be adding different things to them because they're fragile as well. There's a reason, why the state goes through extraordinary lengths to protect them. Sometimes can maybe a little overbearing, some of the regulations, but the point is that, they're fragile as well. So I'd be very careful of the things you do in wetlands as well. Also, from a lake ecological perspective, they provide the nursery habitat, especially when they're flooded, for a lot of your fish and invertebrates that, provide you benefit.
Frogs.
Yeah, frogs, turtles, waterfowl.
You mentioned, I'm not lakefront, but as I walk around, I see all the flags for the pesticides on the lakefront properties. And it's a concern only because years back, I remember, I don't know if there were regulations concerning pesticide use on lakefront properties or not. If there's not, is there any alternative or organic method that would be better than what's in use right now?
So I'm going to have to defer the part as far as the alternatives for lake lawns, because that's not my expertise, but I can talk about pesticides in general.
Just curious.
No, that's fine, yeah. Because I think some of the general ideas, one of the misnomers about pesticides is, they have gone through, every pesticide at least that we use in the lake and that's used in the lawn goes through an extensive, and when I say extensive, 7 to 10 year process to have it approved by the EPA for even it to be sold. And every pesticide has a label on it that has to be used via the label or it's illegal. It's a federal law. You break federal law if you don't use it. So that's why applicators, so people that will commercially come in and spray, they have to go through so many hoops to be able to implement those things. However, homeowners that buy Roundup or 2,4-D over the top, they're obviously may not be as educated about that. Pesticides, like anything else, it's more about dose and exposure than it's so much about the particular pesticide. A lot of these pesticides, they break down naturally. For example, glyphosate, the minute it hits water, it starts to photodegrade, so it doesn't really stay in water as long, but that's done, that's if it's used with the right amount and that stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's good to know.
Yeah. Like I said, I don't want to talk about the actual specific lawn stuff just because I don't have the expertise in that particular.
And actually, I don't either, but I think that's something that we should definitely do a lot more research on to understand what the best practices are. So I would say from our standpoint, we'll work with INA to help develop what a good solution for that would be. I would say, just as a caveat, that unfortunately the EPA is not always the best regulatory body,
Yes.
and that glyphosate in particular has been being banned around the world now, which is the primary agent in Roundup.
Right.
And it also it's an application issue, right? So unfortunately, if you apply Roundup commercially as a firm, you need to get regulated. You need to wear a hazmat suit, all these different things. And unfortunately, you can go to Home Depot and buy 10 gallons of it if you want.
And that's where even
unregulated.
Exactly. Even with algae control in ponds, copper sulfate was one of the biggest things they used to use back in the 50s, and used to buy bricks of it and throw it in there. And that obviously isn't Yeah, no, a very, very good point about the EPA. You know,
There's a big debate that's waging right now,
Yeah.
maybe outside of America, because Roundup is owned by Monsanto, which has got a heavy lobbyist presence in DC. But around the world, they're banning glyphosate for different reasons. Primarily, it's like a known carcinogen.
Yeah. It's important to have a really scrutinous eye when it comes to these pesticides. There's a big issue with soybeans in Alabama, where a particular herbicide drifted off-site from farms and actually killed a bunch of the non-genetic. Oh no, the herbicide they used, if I remember correctly, was an older strain that Monsanto had a new resistant soybean to, and basically the farmers were applying the pesticide, I guess, in not the correct way, and it drifted from one farm to another, and you know, so yeah, so pesticides is something, you know, I think it's always good to have a very scrutinous eye on. It's not the only technique. You know, hand pulling is one way, and I'm speaking because we do it in lakes too. Hand pulling is one way, organic measures are one way, but you know, there's costs and benefits to a lot of them. And purely, at least I can speak for the lakes, in the research, there's plenty of research that says that pesticides in the aquatic, they work and they break down quickly, but that's not always the case. And like I said, that's all dependent on exposure and how much it goes in and your particular site. So it's a complicated subject.
I want to add one tiny thing to where Regina started, which is that she's not on lakefront. And it's true that the lakefront people have the most impact on the lake, but it's not true that other people don't have impact. People who are not right on the lakefront are still in the watershed, and still that water that runs off those steep slopes of homes around the lake eventually gets into the lake.
Yeah, I want to just add to what you just said. I actually am of the opinion that there's more property that's off the lakefront than on, and it's steeper slopes for the most part. And the impervious surfaces, the driveways, hitting the road. As I was driving in today, I just saw the water streaming down from upland, hitting the road and going into the highway drains and straight into the lake. So I think that there's as much an impact from the upland properties as well. Maybe it's somewhat different, but maybe their septic systems are not emptying directly into the lake as some of the shorefront properties are. But there's still a significant volume of water that's running and catching things from the road and from the soil. So.
And I think that's exactly why we kind of need an outside expert to kind of help us, to come in and help us identify where those pollutants, you know, I guess, are coming from, so we can come up with an action plan that's appropriate.
Yeah, and it's important to think of these things on a watershed scale, you know, the entire basin where water can potentially drain in, because if the uplands are starting to do some, you know, little remediations, either better drainage ditches or better, you know, home plantings, and that reduces the impact as it goes down into the lake.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to comment about something you said, AJ, that
Sure.
people rarely talk about, which is dealing with the town legislatively. We have a pretty good set of wetlands regulations, and I would encourage everyone to look at them. It's, I think it's section 144 of the town code. There's a lot in there that we can and can't do, and we need to understand what's on the books. Now, in this town, it's not very well enforced. It's not, you know, there's some, it's, you know, but at least it lays out the roadmap of what good lake neighbors should be doing. But do you have any examples of communities that have worked with the town to either tighten legislation or, you know, in some way add to existing regulations?
I'd have to, the one lake our company works with is Oscawana in the town of Putnam Valley. I'll have to look further. One thing I didn't say is I got hired in the company 6 months ago, so a lot of the old legislation stuff from Oscawana is a little foreign to me. What I will say as far as the wetlands is when I go to a lake and the lake contacts me and I look it up online, the first or maybe the second thing I do is go on the DEC website, and they have an environmental resource mapper, and it basically maps out all the wetlands in New York State.
Yeah.
So I go to the lake that I look at the wetlands, and some lakes, the DEC classifies the entire shoreline to be a wetland. And that immediately sets a flag off on my head, because there's a whole bunch of techniques that I can't even suggest, because there's a wetland there. You know, and I was talking about the classes of wetlands, those are listed on that environmental resource map.
Well, I think here in this community, it's a 100-foot wetland buffer.
Mhm.
And there are regulated activities within that wetland buffer that we cannot,
Yeah.
cannot do.
So what I will say is, in terms of the question as far as the town legislation, I'll have to get back to you on Oscawana, but what I will say is that wetlands, it doesn't just stop at the town. I mean, you deal with Army Corps of Engineers, you deal with the state level, you know, Fish and Wildlife, you know, also understanding if there's a protected species within that wetland is another important thing that really can dictate what you can do and what you can't do. So knowing all those things kind of going into that, but as far as Oscawana, I'll have to get back to you on that. Like, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, I just,
I'm particularly interested in knowing whether any communities have instituted regulations about, say, requiring stormwater runoff, or stormwater runoff mitigation. Rain gardens, are they required, or bioswales, things like that, even at the point where the driveway meets the road, not just where the lawn meets the lake. Those sorts of things. I'd like to see if there are any examples of that kind of, you know, regulations or guidelines anyway,
yeah.
on any books. You know, we recently instituted a 5-year septic pump out law,
Yeah.
so there's understanding, and gaining understanding and interest in doing these things and regulating them to get them, you know, happening. But there's so much more, as I understand it, something like 23% of our nutrient load is external, and that's a lot to, I mean, that's non-septic, that's just, you know, other things.
Yeah.
There's a lot we can do with that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any regulations that have been passed on to individual
Yeah, I
homeowners
was
about
supposed to say
stormwater
that, yeah.
management, particularly.
Unless you do new construction, and then
Right.
they come down on your heart.
Right. But in terms of implementing
Yeah,
rain
that's
gardens
an
or other-
interesting point, Fran, because you were required to do something.
$15,000.
Eula was.
Water,
So,
tags and
Yep.
spiders.
yeah, so
from
that's, were you required to do any stormwater mitigation?
No.
When you did construction? No. So this is, you know, another example of where it's very inconsistently enforced
Yeah.
around here. And,
Well, most often you're being asked with new construction to deal with it on your own property, to do
Mhm.
whatever the surface, the runoff
Right,
would
that's
be
what it
from
was,
whatever
yeah.
impervious surface you're putting down. So I mean, that's in general, that's a good idea.
Well, we didn't put down
Right.
the impervious surface, they looked at our driveway, we
Yeah.
did nothing that was
Okay.
related to that, but they looked into it.
In my experience, generally, they're kind of looking at the overall lot coverage and the amount of impervious surface coverage, and then they're looking for you to manage your stormwater on your own site. And so there's all sorts of ways to do that, like more heavy engineering methods of spreading it and, you know, finding ways of infiltrating it on your own site, or more surface types like installation of rain gardens and other kind of more ephemeral features. I mean, I think that would, for me, tie into both like the individual property owner's responsibility, and I think most often, from my opinion, like it's like access to information. So getting people the information of what they can do on their own. I mean, regulation is, I think, a whole nother animal potentially.
Yeah.
And then lake management on a whole, right? So can we identify the storm sewers that have the heaviest impact on the road, and as a community, you know, put an easement on that land or buy back that land, and then institute, you know, rain garden or other retention features to mitigate the impact on those particular points.
Right.
But again, that would have to come from like a lake management plan, and then
And a strong lake association.
Right.
So, you know, it's really, again, what you're hearing are things that are not gonna be done in one season or 1 year, or so we can fix it up for next summer. They're gonna take time, they're gonna take patience, and they're gonna take really a lot of people cooperating and being interested. AJ said something to me the other day that really stuck, which is that if everything you did on your own property only affected your own property, that would be one thing. But it really affects
as you get further on, 5-10 years down the road, you get a management plan, you implement some of these actions, show it off, flaunt it, brag about it, because that's the only way you continue to get funding for these projects, to show, hey, listen, we went through this plan, we implemented this stuff, we've had 3 years of, let's say, reduced nutrient loads that has a positive impact on the community. Let's say you buy up a piece of land and you do an easement and you convert it into a good stormwater retention pond, and show that stuff off, because that really helps pay in the future. As your association gets 20 or 30 years down the road, you have people that still remember the successes. When the story I told about Lake Gaston, which is the lake with the hydrilla, we finally got control of it over, it's from 1990 up to now. And one of the biggest challenges in the association was to continue to say, listen, we've got this great success, we brag about it, but the next step is to make sure we have money in place just in case the next problem happens. Because there's always another problem that comes up. It's plants, or it's algae, or it's sediment, or it's some invasive fish, and the complacency kind of sets in once things become good. So it's always good to have that kind of foresight in mind, and bragging about it and saying, oh, listen, look at what we did, and this was such a great success. It helps kind of keep that keeps it fresh in people's minds that we had a problem back, and we, through our vigilance, fixed it. So any other problem, we can still do this. Associations change with their memberships over time, and so it's important to keep that kind of through line to kind of help.
Even if we've been doing things and they've been working for 70 years, we have to remember that conditions are changing, weather conditions are changing, the condition of all the septic systems is changing, that they're aging, they're losing their effectiveness. So there is a change that's happening that means that if we're not looking at how to adjust what we're doing to the changes, we're not being really helpful.
There's been some discussion regarding one of the mitigation solutions as floating artificial planted islands.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear you talk about that in the other solutions that you mentioned. So what are your thoughts on those?
So the floating islands, I think they have the potential to be good. It's something I've actually been meaning to sit down and really go through the scientific literature on. It's not something I'm really familiar with. The one thing I will say with any technique like that, the amount of floating islands versus the size of your lake, there needs to be an understanding of, how many islands do we need on a particular lake if the goal is to affect nutrient concentrations, how many do you need to be able to actually achieve that particular goal? Now, floating islands serve other goals, they provide habitat, for waterfowl. So if that's another goal, then maybe it's not so much as how much is out there. But
But what if you think about it in terms of, the site specific? So you're just talking about a cove. So you can really make an impact in this one cove with one or two.
It's possible.
Then you just go cove by cove over many years.
Well, like any technique, what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify where it's going to have the most impact. So some coves, if there's a bunch of nutrients coming in that can be potentially uptaken by these floating wetlands, then maybe that's where you have to go. And I guess it kind of gets to the larger point that any technique you put in, anytime you spend money, you got to really research it, before, during, and after to make sure, this wasn't that good of an idea or it was a good